Quiet on set. Speed and action.
We're stepped out upon the world stage now. Now! With the fate of human dignity in our hands.
Welcome to the Foot and Friends on Film podcast, discussing everything about cinema. Now here's your host, Nick Baylor.
Two little mice. It's a velociraptor. Cow in a bucket of cream. You take 6 more questions.
Welcome to the official podcast of Foot and Friends on Film.com, where we discuss everything about cinema. I'm your host, Nick Mailer. On today's show, we're going to talk about aliens and bullwhips and aliens and sharks and dinosaurs and artificial intelligence in World War II and aliens again and World War II again, because it's Steven Spielberg. Welcome to the show, everybody. This is a long one. I'm not going to waste any time. You know the routine. It's time to welcome John H. Foote. Do you think the name Steven Spielberg indeed deserves to be so ubiquitous when it comes to Hollywood and movie making in general?
Yeah, I do. I don't think he's got anything left to prove. I don't think he's got nothing to apologize for. He paid his dues. He's made some brilliant films. He's made some very good films, and he's made a couple stinkers. What's always been unique about Spielberg is his growth as a film director through the years. He's always strived to get better. He's never been content to sit and rest on his laurels. He's always wanted to improve and become greater than he was. And for a long time, there was a real sense that he didn't think he would be a great filmmaker till he won the Academy Award. Well, he was a great filmmaker by his second film. I mean, Jaws is the work of a master filmmaker. Is he the best director in movies? No, I think Martin Scorsese deserves that. But Spielberg is up there. He's certainly the most successful, by far the most successful, and one of the greatest storytellers, period. And his mastery of the camera, I think, is second to none.
He's been criticized for relying too much on sentiment. Do you think that's warranted?
Sometimes, but there was no sentiment in some of his best films. There's no sentiment at all in Empire of the Sun. There's none in Munich. I mean, Munich is an ice-cold movie. I didn't find any sentiment in Lincoln. I found none in Schindler's List. I found none in Saving Private Ryan. But is it there? Yeah, it's there. It nearly ruins one of his better films, War of the Worlds. The last 30 seconds of that movie very nearly undoes the entire film. So yes,
we'll get to that for sure.
Yeah, he's been sucked into sentimentality before, but a lot of directors have. He's not alone. He's certainly not alone.
And obviously, you're telling stories. Sentiment's a big part of that.
They would, and he really draws from his childhood. And movies, when Spielberg was a kid, were sentimental for the most part.
He was heavily influenced by the works of Frank Capra.
Very much, and that's sentimentality at its best. From the 1950s on, most of Frank Capra's movies were nicknamed Capricorn because they're very corny. They're all American, love thy neighbor, do your best for everybody type of movies. Frank Capra created the art of film directing, he and Charlie Chaplin together through the 1930s. And he made some of the greatest films ever made. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Lost Horizon, It's a Wonderful Life. The guy is a giant. But his movies have that all-Americana corny aspect to them. They're like watching a Frank Rockwell or Norman Rockwell painting move. And Spielberg was very, very influenced by his work.
So Steven Spielberg, starting from a very early age, was obsessed with movie making. And, as a kid, he had a Super 8 camera and started making his own short films and all of that jazz. You want to talk a little bit about Steven Spielberg, the amateur filmmaker, sort of like leading up to the 1970s?
Sure. He was a gawky kid. He grew up in Arizona, and his family was Jewish, and you don't find many Jewish families in Arizona. So he was an outsider. He was bullied, he was picked on, but he also marched to the beat of his own drummer. He didn't care that he was bullied and picked on, and he found a way to make the bullies his friends by putting them in his movies. And he was fascinated with the war. His father had been in the Second World War in the Pacific Theater. So he gathered his buddies together, and his dad gave him a Super 8 camera, and he shot movies about the war. And you can see a lot of these on YouTube, and they're pretty good for a kid. When you consider it's a little kid making them, the style of the shots and the way he cut them together, he was a born filmmaker. He understood from a very early age how to put the images together to tell a story. And he moved through the 1960s working a lot in television, directing sitcoms on TV, dramatic pieces, television movies. And he finally made a film called Duel in 1971 with Dennis Weaver about a mysterious truck with no driver that's chasing this guy on the highway. And the main guys in Hollywood that saw this movie went out of their mind for it. And it was on television at Francis Ford Coppola's home, and George Lucas happened to be there. And the two of them watched it, and they were stunned. They said, we've got to get to know this guy. So immediately he was called and invited to the beach house with Margot Kidder and the gang on Sunday for a Chilean beer. And when he gets there, he's this awkward, painfully shy, terrified of women, small town kid. And one of the first things he did with his first paycheck, he ran out and bought a bright orange Trans Am and stood out like a sore thumb in Hollywood, and immediately realized everybody else was driving a Mercedes. So he turned in his car and got a Mercedes. But he became part of the group through Duel and graduated to filmmaking very quickly. Sid Sheinberg took a chance on him. And by 1974, he was making feature films.
So jumping to 1974, the Sugarland Express. You want to talk a little bit about this? It marks the first collaboration between Spielberg and his longtime composer, John Williams.
Yeah, it does. Sugarland Express is a road movie, and he was given it by Sid Sheinberg, who he's always credited with being kind of his godfather and guiding his career. Sheinberg was a major producer at Universal. He later was the head of Universal. And he thought this was a perfect film for Spielberg. It was very much on the road, small characters. It didn't really need a lot. So he gave him the movie, and when it opened, Pauline Kael, the great film critic for The New Yorker, said, and I quote, "This is the greatest film directing debut since Orson Welles and Citizen Kane," which is enormous praise. And I've gone back and watched the movie a couple times. It's okay. It's a solid movie from top to bottom. I don't think it's a great film, and I'm very surprised she would say that. But it was good enough that Universal was willing to take a chance on him for his next film, which he picked up. He picked up the script for Jaws off Sid Sheinberg's desk and said, "What's this?" And well, the rest is history.
Jaws is a landmark film for so many reasons, not the least of which is creating essentially the movie season that we're all so familiar with now.
Yes, it did. Jaws was released in June. And from that moment on, the Hollywood guys got together and created a calendar from January to April is kind of the dog season when they release everything they don't know how to release. Although sometimes there are great films released in that time. The Godfather was released in February. May through August, end of August is blockbuster season. And that's essentially what Jaws created. And then the prestige season comes in September through December 31st. But what Spielberg did with Jaws was I think ground the horror genre in something so unspeakably realistic. He scared the living bejesus out of people. I saw Jaws the second night it opened, and I watched popcorn fly in the air. The jumps and the terror and the screams was just unbelievable. One guy ran out of the theater. I don't know what he did in the lobby, but ran back in. And when he sat down, his wife said, "Why'd you come back?" And he said, "I gotta see what happens." And that seemed to be the sense with Jaws. As much as it scared the hell out of people, they wanted to see what happens. And the story is very basic. A shark, a great white shark, is feasting on the bathers off the New England shore. And three guys head out on a boat to try to kill the shark. A police chief who's terrified of the water, an oceanographer who specializes in sharks, and a salty old shark hunter who hunts sharks because he was nearly killed by them on the SS Indianapolis during the war. And Spielberg recast the movie. The original film was going to star Charlton Heston as Brody, or Charles Bronson, God help us, as the old shark hunter, and Richard Dreyfuss was always in place to play Hooper. And Spielberg went ahead and recast the thing. And his boldest move was casting Robert Shaw as Quint. Shaw was a playwright who'd got an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actor for playing Henry VIII in A Man for All Seasons, but he wasn't really recognized as an actor. And doing that was absolutely brilliant. Then they all head off to New England to make the movie. They've got 3 massive 32-foot mechanical sharks. 2 of them sink. They sink to the bottom of the sea. They're gone. So Spielberg, thinking fast on his feet, decides, I won't show much of the shark. So he doesn't. We see the fin, or we see the buoys that they fire on by harpoons that are supposed to bring the shark to the top of the ocean. We rarely see the shark until the end of the film. And it was terrifying. It was absolutely terrifying. It's Hitchcock's old adage, less is more. And then you mentioned his buddy John Williams from Sugarland Express creates probably the most iconic score in movie history. And a lot of the shots were created from the shark's point of view, which was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. He didn't hold back on the gore. I mean, when that shark attacks that little boy, it's literally a gusher of blood exploding out of the sea. But it was such a beautifully directed and edited film, nearly a perfect film, I would think, and massive hit. Became the #1 movie of all time over 3 months.
You talk about grounding a monster movie in reality. There really isn't any more perfect subject matter. First of all, because the ocean is terrifying because it's all calm and uniform on top, and underneath is just an entire world of horrifying shit going on, and you've got a massive predator with steak knives for teeth that's largely been untouched by evolution for hundreds of millions of years because it's such an effective killer.
That's right. Richard Dreyfuss has that great line where he says to the town mayor, this thing is a perfect machine. All it does is eat, swim, and make little sharks. And that's absolutely what it does. And it is terrifying. Sharks are frightening. And what isn't widely known about them is that they don't hunt people. They don't seek out people. But if you happen to look like a seal or some type of large prey in the water, they're going to bite you. And if they bite you, they're going to inflict some serious damage, especially a great white shark, because they can swallow you whole, head, feet, the whole thing down the hatch.
Yeah, the vast majority of shark species pose no threat to humans, but there are usually tiger sharks, great whites, and hammerheads, and it's usually a case of mistaken identity, like you said.
Yeah.
And with a shark's only usable appendage being its mouth, sometimes it bites just to test things out. And like you said, if you get a test bite from a great white shark, you're losing a leg.
That's right. That's right. And Spielberg, this movie came out in the summer of 1975. And I remember being taken by my mom and dad to a cottage in Halliburton for a week. People were afraid to go into a lake because they'd seen Jaws. It had that profound an impact on audiences. They were scared to go into waters where sharks can't exist. I'd never seen anything like it. It was on the cover of Time magazine, Newsweek, Maclean's, Life. It was everywhere. And it wasn't, some audience movies are not necessarily critically acclaimed. Critics love this movie. They couldn't find a flaw in it. And when the Academy Award nominations roll around, Spielberg does one of the stupid things of his career. He sensed he'd be nominated. He sensed the film would be nominated. So he invites the live TV cameras into his home to watch his reaction when he's nominated. Well, he's not nominated. The film's nominated for Best Picture. It gets 4 nominations in total, which is pretty measly when you think about it, really. But he was ignored for Best Director, and direction is probably the film's strongest point. It was a real slap in the face for a young director. And it showed 2 things. First of all, it showed that Hollywood can be cruel and stupid. And second, Spielberg really needed his ego stroked in his early days. He's gotten over it. But in the early days, he really needed to be told how terrific he was.
In 1977, Spielberg's good friend, George Lucas, released a little sci-fi fantasy film called Star Wars. But Spielberg also crossed into that genre the same year with Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Just talk about that film.
My brother and I saw Close Encounters of the Third Kind the second day at an afternoon matinee in Toronto at the old York Cinema. It's gone now. And when we came out, the TV cameras were talking to people as they exited the theater because it was a big deal. And I remember standing behind this black lady who was weeping after seeing the film. And they asked her what was it about the movie that hit her so hard? And she said the last 45 minutes are like seeing God coming face to face with our creator. And Steve and I looked at each other and thought, she's right. She's absolutely right. The movie deals with man's first encounter with an alien race. And NASA has created these close encounter codes. First kind is sighting of a UFO. Second kind is physical evidence. Third is contact. And the whole film is a race to the last 45 minutes where the aliens land and make themselves known to us. And it's just filled with such awe and wonder and breathtaking majesty. And when these little creatures come down and speak to us, they speak to us through hand signs that they use to teach music with. And those 5 notes spell out whatever there is they're saying. I like to think it's hello. The casting again,
Peace, baby.
yeah, the casting again was perfect. Richard Dreyfuss as the man who was given a telepathic signal through the aliens to be at Devil's Tower that night. The scientist working with the peace program, played by the director Francois Truffaut, was perfect. And they found this little kid somewhere in Indiana, Carrie Guffey, a 3-year-old, who's abducted by the aliens, but is returned to his mother at the end. And his face was perfect, just so beatific in every way. And it really demonstrated Spielberg's growth as a filmmaker. And this time, the Academy nominated him for Best Director, but they didn't nominate the damn film. And a lot of critics, this critic included, I was a very young critic then, thought Close Encounters was the best film of its year.
Extraterrestrials is subject matter that Spielberg would revisit several times throughout his career. But in 1981, he made another landmark film, a little action adventure film called Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yeah, he and his buddy George Lucas were in Hawaii on vacation. Spielberg was licking his wounds after the colossal failure of 1941, a $40 million comedy that was a dud and dead on arrival when it opened in theaters. And Spielberg had been offered a James Bond film. And Lucas said to him, I think I got something better. And he explained the whole story of Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark to Spielberg on the beach. And Spielberg agreed then and there, I'll do it. And he said, the only thing, I've got 2 conditions. One, that I direct and only direct. I don't want to produce, I don't want to write, I only want to direct. And 2, you're the boss. Keep me on budget. If you look at Raiders of the Lost Ark, it's a period film laden with visual effects. There's a lot of effects in this film. They made that film for $8 million. Wow. Spielberg needed $40 million to do 1941, a year and a half earlier. But for $8 million, they made Raiders of the Lost Ark. And it instantly made Harrison Ford iconic. And this was his second jump at being iconic. He was iconic already as Han Solo in Star Wars. And now here he is as Indiana Jones. And Spielberg has always been the master of the great entrance. If you go through his movies and watch the entrances of his characters, they're all terrific. And this one is in particular wonderful. He's about to be ambushed by his so-called helpers in the jungle, and he realizes it. He hears the click of a gun. He turns, nails the guy with a bullwhip. The gun goes off. They run, and he walks into view with this snarling look on his face. And that's it. We were in that movie. There's more excitement in the first 10 minutes of that film than there are some movies in their entire running time. It just hit the ground running, and it never lets you go. And again, massive box office hit and great critical acclaim, 8 Academy Award nominations. It won 4 Oscars. Best film of the year? No. I think Warren Beatty's Reds was the best film of the year, but certainly the most entertaining and fun movie of the year. Easily the most beloved by audiences.
And here we are almost 4 decades later, and they're about to start another one.
Yeah, and I think they're foolish. We'll talk more about that later, I hope, but I think they're being very foolish making another one.
Yeah, we'll get to that. Very next year, Spielberg would revisit the theme of aliens with a wonderful little film called E.T. the Extraterrestrial.
And again,
Did
I
you
say
believe
this
this
a
was the
lot.
best film of its year?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's his second best film, right behind Schindler's List. I say this a lot. I saw this on opening day. I see most movies opening day. Now I see them obviously before opening day. E.T. had grown men weeping in their theater. I was 21, and I was one of those grown men weeping at the end of E.T. When that kid has to say goodbye to that little alien, my heart was breaking, and it was breaking along with all the other patrons in the movies. He took a movie, and what people forget about E.T., the leading man in E.T. is a special effect. He's a 3.5 foot chunk of latex with wires coming out his back that make him move. And the actors, that little kid, Henry Thomas, had to give that extraordinary performance next to a chunk of latex. That kid should have got an Academy Award nomination. That's one of the greatest child performances put on film ever. Spielberg was very smart in shooting the movie through the eyes of E.T. and Elliot. We never really see grown-ups' faces except for the mother and later the scientist with the keys on his hip. Most of the time we see them from the waist up. And he captured the world of children to perfection. Drew Barrymore was, I think, 5, 6 years old when she made that movie. She's wonderful. Robert McNaughton is the older brother, but the movie belongs to Henry Thomas. He is spectacular. The movie also belongs to the special effects crew. The creation of E.T. was dazzling, dazzling. Here is a character who doesn't exist, but you believe he exists. And part of it was the design. They gave him the eyes of Albert Einstein, and perfect, perfect, because he's ancient. He's centuries old, we suspect, and yet he's filled with wonder and childlike awe at what he's finding on Earth. And he connects with this little boy. Some of the
And
cinematography.
adorable.
Oh, pardon?
And E.T. is adorable.
He is adorable. Absolutely, he's adorable. And some of the shots were just brilliant. That shot across the moon when they're riding in the forest, and Elliot's reaction when the bike takes off, and that John Williams score builds and builds and builds to the bike takeoff, and it flies again at the end where they're trying to elude the FBI men. I mean, it was just such a perfectly made movie. And as far as being the best movie of the year, when Richard Attenborough won his Academy Award for Best Director for Gandhi, which simply wasn't the best movie of the year, on his way to the stage, he stopped at Steven Spielberg's chair and whispered in his ear, "This belongs to you, you know," and did the same thing when E.T. won Best Picture. The only critic groups that had the guts to give E.T. Best Picture were the National Society of Film Critics and the LA Film Critics. The other groups went with Gandhi or Tootsie. Tootsie was a great film too. But Gandhi, no way. No way it was Best Picture over E.T.
So there's an important question I want to ask because I've gotten different answers. Did Steven Spielberg ghost direct Poltergeist?
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you watch Poltergeist, it's got the same feel of a Spielberg movie, the same look of a Spielberg movie. He called the shots. Tobe Hooper might have got credit for directing, and I think that was a favor to Spielberg, but Steven Spielberg was on set of Poltergeist every single day. So yes, he did ghost direct it. He'll never admit it. He'll never admit it, but watch it. Watch it from beginning to end, and it's a Spielberg movie through and through.
All right, you heard it here, folks. In 1984, we would once again have an adventure with Indiana Jones when Steven Spielberg made The Temple of Doom. The film, while doesn't really play that way, is a prequel to Raiders of the Lost Ark, right?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And I remember being very disappointed by the Temple of Doom, and part of it was the portrayal of cruelty to children, the way that the Indian children were portrayed in the mines being the slaves. I thought it was a kind of an irresponsible study of child labor and didn't work for me. The violence was shocking when Indy's heart is pulled out of him, and Indy turns nasty under the spell and starts slugging the little guy short round that's always with him. a really dark Indiana Jones movie, and it didn't have the wham bang zing feel of the first one at all. And a lot of critics pointed that out. I was disappointed. It made a fortune. It made off like gangbusters at the box office. But for me, it's the second weakest of the Indiana Jones films.
For me, it's actually at the bottom by a sizable measure. We'll get into that in a bit, but Temple of Doom is my least favorite of the series.
You know what? I saw it in 1984. I watched it once with my wife because she'd never seen it, and I've never watched it again. It's sitting here on my shelf, and I've never touched it.
In 1985, Steven Spielberg made The Color Purple. I know you've got lots to say.
I'm probably going to annoy a lot of people with this. Steven Spielberg wanted acceptance from the Academy. He believed the only way to get acceptance from the Academy was to make a serious movie. So he purchased the rights to Alice Walker's brilliant book, The Color Purple. And my belief is that he made this movie because he wanted to be accepted as a serious director. And what better way than for a white Jewish director to direct a film about the Black experience? And maybe so, but if you're going to do that, direct a film about the Black experience. Don't change it. Don't Disneyfy it and make it a zippity-doo-dah kind of movie. I watched The Color Purple at a theater in 1985, and I was embarrassed for Steven Spielberg. I was embarrassed that he didn't have the guts to shoot the novel that Alice Walker wrote, which is an angry, spiky, dark novel about this poor Black woman, Celie, who's abused by her father, abused by every man she ever encounters. So when she finally falls in love, it's with a woman. And Spielberg skips over the whole lesbian aspect of the story. They have a very chaste kiss between each other, but we don't know if they sleep together. We don't know if she has an orgasm or not with her friend, and she does in the book. It's very clear in the book. And there are moments in the movie where the color is so overwhelming that you think you're watching a Disney movie. Had an animated character walked out of the bush, I wouldn't have been surprised. It has one saving grace, the performance of Whoopi Goldberg. Whoopi Goldberg is absolutely sensational as Celie as written for the film. It's not the Celie from the book. It should be, because Goldberg was up to that. It also has the distinction of one of the worst movie scores I've ever heard. And it's dreadful. It's overwhelming. It tells you what to think. It's just bad. When the Academy Award nominations came out, The Color Purple was nominated for 11, but it was snubbed for Best Director. I don't have a problem with that. I don't think Spielberg deserved a nomination for Best Director. I don't think it's a well-directed film. I think by changing the tone and even the content, he screwed it up. He screwed up a great book. And frankly, he should be ashamed of himself.
Should be noted that unlike most of Spielberg's films that are composed by John Williams, the score was provided by Quincy Jones for The Color Purple.
Yes, and Quincy Jones is a half-decent composer. He won an Oscar for Shaft, but not here. Not here. I don't know what he was thinking. Maybe he thought his music was what the movie was all about, but it wasn't. It was a very humanist story. I get angry talking about The Color Purple because it could have been a great film. It should have been a great film. And I hope one day they remake it. They did do a stage version that was quite good. But I don't know what Spielberg was. Well, I do know what he was thinking, and that's why he should be ashamed of himself.
1987, Steven Spielberg he tackled a subject that he's revisited several times, and that's war. And he collaborated with a young child actor named Christian Bale, who I think has gone on to do some other stuff.
A few.
I think so. So that film was Empire of the Sun. I know this is a favorite of yours. Discuss it a bit.
Empire of the Sun opened in December of 1987, and I saw two films that day. I saw The Last Emperor in the morning, and I saw the Empire of the Sun in the afternoon. And there was no question in my mind when Empire of the Sun ended, I'd just seen the best movie of the year. I was knocked on my ass by this movie. I couldn't believe it was the same man who directed The Color Purple. With this one, he did everything right. It's based on a book by J.G. Ballard, who really was a prisoner of war in the Japanese internment camp when he was separated from his parents. So it's based on his life. Everything Spielberg did he did properly. He had a certain amount of time to shoot in Shanghai, 15 days, and they shut Shanghai down for his shoot. And all of those scenes at the beginning of the film, the crowds and Jamie being torn apart from his parents, he shot those scenes in 15 days. And how he did it, I don't know, but he didn't miss a beat. He got it all done. He drew a performance from Christian Bale. We know today Christian Bale is one of the greatest actors in movies. But as a little boy, he drew a performance from him that's right up there with Henry Thomas in E.T., magnificent. The John Williams score, the cinematography, Spielberg's direction, perfect, a perfect film. And yet when it opened, it failed. It was not a box office hit at all. Critics loved it. It won the National Board of Review Award for Best Picture and Director coming out of the gate, but nobody went to see it. And I've still never figured that out, because I think it's one of his greatest films. You know, before Schindler's List, this and E.T. are probably his two strongest films.
How much would you like to see another collaboration between Bale and Spielberg?
Oh, I'd love it. I'd love it. I'd always kind of wished.
Happened.
Yeah, I'd always kind of wished he'd cast Christian Bale in Minority Report. That would have been cool. In the Tom Cruise part, that would have been exciting.
Oh, you know, yeah, because Christian Bale did that film Equilibrium, which was also sort of a dystopian.
Yeah, yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah. There's a film from 1989. Two of them we're going to talk about, but the film Always. You want to discuss this a bit? This is not widely known as something that pops into your head when you think Spielberg.
No, one of Spielberg's favorite films is a 1941 war film called A Guy Named Joe, about a bomber guy who's shot down. Spencer Tracy plays him. He's shot down and lives his life watching his friends and their lives unfold. With Always, he transplanted it to forest fighter pilots dropping water, and Richard Dreyfuss being the guy who's killed and has to watch the love of his life live out her life in dreadful grief, trying to find hope and something to live for again. It was pretty anticipated, because it had Dreyfuss reuniting with Spielberg. It had Holly Hunter, who was red hot at the time after Broadcast News and Raising Arizona. So there were lots of hopes for this movie, but it just didn't work. And it didn't work on so many levels that it was critically attacked and a box office dud. So really, really unfortunate.
That same year, we got, after the bad taste left in some mouths from the Temple of Doom, we got another Indiana Jones film with Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, which I think is just lovely.
I agree completely. And what makes it lovely is Sean Connery.
Right.
Sean Connery was cast as Indiana's dad, and he ends up in trouble with the Nazis, and Indiana rescues him, and then they get into all kinds of trouble. Before any of this happens, there's a wonderful introduction with River Phoenix as the young Indiana Jones, and we see how he got his hat, how he became this cocky archaeologist, and that was terrific. The chemistry between Harrison Ford and Sean Connery was spectacular. Probably the best male chemistry I had seen since Robert Redford and Paul Newman and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. They were terrific together. And again, the movie was fun. Indiana Jones was fun to watch again. It wasn't gruesomely violent. It wasn't horrific in its subject matter. It was just a ball of fire from the very beginning. Had a supernatural aspect to it with a holy grail. Great movie. What can you not say about it? It was a terrific entertainment and a knockout of a film.
Something very cool about Indiana Jones's dad being James Bond.
Absolutely. Absolutely. A great connection there from the beach in Hawaii when they first talked about it, and Spielberg was considering a Bond movie. Well, he got to direct Bond after all.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a film that is widely mentioned as a bad Spielberg film, and I've never agreed with that consensus, but I want you to talk about Hook, which stars Robin Williams, and it's a takeoff of the Peter Pan legend. We meet a family man who has amnesia, but it turns out he once was Peter Pan. You want to talk a little bit about that movie and the reaction and what your thoughts are?
Well, I hate Hook. I've always hated Hook. I hated Hook from the moment I first saw it. And I was excited about it. I mean, a great cast: Robin Williams, Dustin Hoffman, Julia Roberts, Bob Hoskins, great cast. And I went to see it, and I watched so many missed opportunities in this movie. The kids were annoying. There was nothing endearing or enchanting about them. So many unanswered questions. Where did the Lost Boys learn how to play basketball? When did that happen? When did they learn to skateboard? They're Lost Boys. They're disconnected from civilization altogether. And yet here they are doing all these things. They refer to Pan as the Pan, not Pan or Peter, but the Pan. And Williams is all geared up to give a great performance as Peter Pan. He's got the stance, the hands on the hips. And Maggie Smith is wonderful as Grand Wendy. You know, the first time you see her, it's nearly haunting. They get to Neverland, and they've got this wonderful pirate ship, the Jolly Roger, moored in the tied to the dock. It never leaves the dock. Not once does it leave the damn dock. Captain Hook is a preening, vain, arrogant bum played by Dustin Hoffman, who has great fun with the role, but it gets tiresome very, very quickly. And for me, 7 different writers worked on this movie. And it's such an easy fix, you know? Toodles, remember Toodles, the old guy in Grand Wendy's care, looking for his marbles? He's lost his marbles. The
Right.
kids mention him. They mention Toodles. Do you know Toodles? Because they knew Toodles. And Toodles is now over 80 years old. And why not send Toodles back to Neverland? They do at the end. Send him back with Peter. You've got a different movie. Because then the kids see that growing old doesn't have to turn you into a pirate. And it was just such a missed opportunity on Spielberg's part. And it's such a noisy, stupid movie. Just a stupid movie. I think it's the worst film he's ever made.
Fair enough.
Sorry.
I was very young when I was watching that movie, so obviously these things eluded me, and I hadn't considered them.
Watch it again and just see what I mean. Because you know what a good movie is. You know what works as a film. Watch this. Consider the talent, and just how unwatchable it really is. It's just awful.
Okay, fair enough. 1993, arguably the biggest year in Steven Spielberg's whole career, saw the release of 2 masterpieces that could not be more dissimilar from one another, other than the fact that they were both directed by Steven Spielberg. I want to talk about the first, which is one of my all-time favorites. As a kid, like many kids, I was fascinated with dinosaurs. And I remember seeing The Land Before Time, and it was a big deal to me. But in 1993, Steven Spielberg, we saw his film based on the Michael Crichton sci-fi novel of the same name, Jurassic Park, about a futuristic theme park where scientists have, through cloning, managed to bring dinosaurs back to life. So many things to say about this film. What was it like the first time you saw it?
Knocked me out. Absolutely knocked me out. I had read the book. I knew it was coming, and I read the book and couldn't wait. And I'd heard so much about this advancement in visual effects that they'd supposedly made. And initially, they were going to do it with stop motion and models, things like that. And Spielberg one day was called over to the computer, and they said, take a look at this and see if we can use it. And he sat there and watched an early CGI dinosaur. And he looked at his stop motion guy and he said, I think you're extinct. And they went ahead and used CGI for the creation of the dinosaurs. That first scene where you see the brachiosaur is stunning. Absolutely stunning. There, you couldn't hear a pin drop in the theater at that moment. It just filled you with such wonder. And again, majesty, which Spielberg seems to bring to the screen so easily. And later in the film, the T-Rex. I mean, the granddaddy of dinosaurs. And he's everything we hope he'll be. He's menacing. He's freaking terrifying. And he knocked it out of the park. Knocked it out of the park. Is it an extremely well-written movie? No, it's an entertainment. But you're never not entertained. And the effects are absolutely astonishing. He showed you the impossible. I mean, it was like seeing Superman for the first time. You believe a man can fly. Here, you'll believe dinosaurs are real. I did. It was a kick-ass entertainment movie. and very quickly became the highest moneymaker of all time. 4 months, I think.
One of, if not the single most affecting experience I've ever had through a movie. And I've said it before and I'll say it again, the greatest moment in the history of cinema is the reveal of that Brachiosaurus, as far as I'm concerned. When the John Williams score, also probably my favorite film score, comes in, and you're right about the effects. Spielberg was all set to use the sort of the cutting edge of stop motion visual effects, which wasn't perfect, but it was almost there. And then when he saw a CGI dinosaur rendered in full daylight, that's when the decision was made. But I remember seeing it, and I believed anything was possible. I remember that moment so specifically.
Absolutely. And, you know, beyond the T-Rex, and that T-Rex attack is one of the most visceral, powerful moments on film. The raptors. I mean, is there something worse than a T-Rex? Yeah, a bunch of raptors, not one, but several, because they tear you to pieces. And he built such great tension in all the scenes with the velociraptors. And again, kids doing great work on film. Ariana Richards, who stopped acting after this, but Joseph Mazzola, who played the little boy, he played the bass guitarist in Bohemian Rhapsody. He's gone on to do a lot of work as an actor. Great work from the kids.
The rippling effect in the glass of water was notable because they had some trouble during production figuring out just the right way to do it, and the solution turned out to be mounting a guitar string under the dash of the dashboard of the car and then plucking it, and that got the perfect effect.
It did, and again, a great entrance. What a great entrance for the T-Rex. I mean, they build it, then we see it, and it's like, oh my God.
It should be noted that through the 2 Jurassic Park sequels and now the 2 Jurassic World films, even in the last movie, there is a T-Rex, and that is the same female T-Rex from the first movie. They make it very clear in the film's materials, and I think that's a way of Spielberg saying, look, you can take the franchise and do what you want with it, but my dinosaur still reigns supreme.
And so it should. So it should.
There's that great moment at the end of the last one where it roars against a lion, and it's like
great
who's
scene.
king of the jungle now.
The one thing they've never managed to do with these reboots of Jurassic Park is bring to it what Spielberg did. You know, his sense of direction, his sense of build-up, his sense of tension. They've never managed to do that.
That's one 1993 Spielberg film, one that can be watched over and over and over again ad nauseum. The other film, a much more important film, not one you're going to revisit just on a whim. Talk about Schindler's List.
Schindler's List is a work of art, an absolute work of art. When he approached Sid Sheinberg about doing this movie, he told him what he wanted to do, and Sheinberg said, it'll never make a dime, but we'll do it. We'll do it because it's you. We owe you for Jurassic Park. He wanted to shoot it in Europe. He wanted to shoot it in black and white. He wanted to use no major male star. He wanted no crane shots, no sweeping camera shots, no shooting stars, nothing that trademarked the movie as a Spielberg movie. He wanted to shoot this like it was a documentary. He'd read the book, Schindler's Ark. And when he went looking for a producer in Europe, Bronto Lustig came up to him, and Spielberg said, well, what have you got that tells me you can produce this movie for me? How can I know you're on the same page as I am? And Bronco Lustig rolled up his arm, and he had a tattoo from Auschwitz on his arm. He'd been a child. And so he went ahead to make the film. He considered Warren Beatty at one point for Oscar Schindler, and then did away with that. He finally cast a young stage actor, Liam Neeson, and he was perfect. And then he shot the film in Europe. Some of it was shot outside the grounds of Auschwitz. They weren't allowed to shoot in Auschwitz because it's a memorial, but they literally built a set outside the gates of Auschwitz. So when the train comes into Auschwitz, it's actually leaving the real Auschwitz and moving into the fake Auschwitz. And Spielberg said that he'd never had such an emotional experience directing a film. He said they'd finish a take and they would all weep together. He'd go home at night and Robin Williams would call him to make him laugh because he had to laugh. He had to have some relief from the staggering impact of making this movie. And it was the first time he'd addressed his heritage on film, the first time he'd addressed being a Jew. Oskar Schindler, for reasons known only to Oskar Schindler, was a Nazi, was a war profiteer, but he decided to save 1,100 factory workers that worked for him. And he spent all of his money. He lied, he swindled, he cheated the Nazis, and managed to save 1,100 people. And I think the number is now 12,000 descendants from Oskar Schindler's Jews. And an absolutely good man and a terrible time. And Spielberg made the greatest film of his career, the greatest film in the 90s, one of the 10 best films ever made was Schindler's List. The day I saw it, I couldn't believe Steven Spielberg had made this movie. I couldn't believe it because it was unlike anything he had done before.
And juxtaposed against his other film from the same year, it's really stunning.
Well, you look at Jurassic Park, and Jurassic Park is a popcorn movie. It's a great one. It's got great effects. Schindler's List is not. You go in to see Schindler's List, you don't eat popcorn, you don't drink Coke. You sit there and you watch, and you can't take your eyes off the atrocities you're seeing on the screen. And you leave the theater, nobody looked at each other, nobody talked to each other. They had just shared in seeing something that profoundly affected them, upset them, scared them, haunted them. And they didn't know what to do. And again, he brought that home to audiences once again, a reminder that the Holocaust happened. This period in time existed when mankind was so horrific to one another. And a race of people was almost wiped out because of what they were. And he brought that to a whole new generation. And with the money he made, and one of the dirty little secrets of Schindler's List, it was a huge box office hit. Not the kind of movie you'd expect to be, but it made over $400 million. Spielberg took his money and created the Shoah Foundation. Because as he was making the movie, Jews would come up to him and tell them their story from the Holocaust. And he thought, well, this should be known. So he started taping stories of these other people coming up to him and created the Shoah Foundation, which is an extraordinary achievement.
Obviously having a profound effect on a director. He didn't direct a movie for several years after that, but when he came back in 1997, he again had a 2-movie year. Did a sequel to Jurassic Park called The Lost World, which certainly not as great as the first one, but 2 things I think that were great about it. The scenes of the T-Rex on the mainland interacting with human civilization, I thought was pretty cool. And he sort of made a point to drive it home that, you know, contrary to using them as fodder for his movies, these aren't monsters. They're just animals acting the way animals do.
Yes.
He also made Amistad. Let's talk a little bit about that.
He did take a long break after Schindler's List. He won his Academy Award for Best Director, won Best Picture. The Oscars were a big deal for him in '93. He won 7 for Schindler's List, and Jurassic Park won 3. So he owned the Oscars in '93. Then he took a long rest, and he came back with a popcorn movie, The Lost World: Jurassic Park. He did not want to do something terribly serious. He wanted to just ease back into directing and have a good time. And you're right, The Lost World is not as good as the first one. The scenes back on the mainland are enjoyable. I don't think it's a great Spielberg film at all, but it made some decent money. Amistad, which came out later in the year, again, Spielberg dealing with the black issue. And though he had grown substantially as a director and did a really good job with this film, it's still the white guys saving the black guys. John Quincy Adams defended Cinque and the rest of the African slaves to the Supreme Court of the United States. That's a fact. And he built the story around that, around John Quincy Adams being the one that comes in and saves the day. Anthony Hopkins plays an ancient ex-president. He's terrific. And Jimon Hunsu is Cinque, the head of the African slaves. And it's a dark, beautifully shot, nicely directed movie. But am I missing something? I never felt it had much of a soul. Where Schindler's List had a soul, Empire of the Sun had a soul, E.T. had a soul. I just didn't feel it with Amistad. There was always something lacking.
You've mentioned this on a previous cast, but we're about to talk about what's arguably the greatest war film ever made. And what were your initial reactions to Saving Private Ryan, particularly the opening?
Couldn't speak. Couldn't speak. I saw that film for the first time at 8 o'clock in the morning at the old Uptown Cinema in Toronto. And they gathered the Toronto film critics in. We went in and we saw the film. We never spoke after seeing a movie. Everybody got up and left. But after Private Ryan, everybody gathered in the lobby and we talked. We actually talked, and we all agreed I'd seen nothing like it. The greatest portrayal of combat ever put on screen. A masterpiece, the Academy Award winner. Spielberg always wanted to make a film about the war for his father. And with Saving Private Ryan, he read a script by Robert Rodat, and movies in Hollywood usually take a few months to come together. Saving Private Ryan came together in 2 weeks. He read the script. Nobody was set to direct it. He decided he'd direct it. Unbeknownst to him, his friend Tom Hanks had also read the script and wanted to play Captain Miller. The head of Paramount, Sherry Lansing, told Spielberg that Hanks wanted the part. He called Hanks, and boom, boom, boom. A month later, they're overseas making this movie. The opening sequence at Normandy in Saving Private Ryan is the single greatest combat scene ever made. I talked to some veterans after seeing it at a private screening, and some of them had been at Normandy. And one of the old guys was sitting there weeping after the film was over, and he said the only thing missing was the smell. You couldn't smell the blood, you couldn't smell the bullets, but the only thing missing was the blood. It's perfect. And to me, that's the greatest testament to Saving Private Ryan you'll ever hear. Beautifully acted by Tom Hanks, who actually took away dialogue. He didn't think his character would be so talky. So he asked if he could strip it away, and they allowed it. And he gives a haunting performance as Captain Miller. They all do. It does have a flaw. It does have, I think, a major flaw, but many masterpieces do, and they get overlooked. And do you remember what it is from film school?
Yes, I do. The zoom in on the eyes, which is replicated on Tom Hanks during the flashback, was misguided. You said it should have been a zoom in on the tombstone, right?
Possibly. My problem with it is we close in on the old man in the cemetery. And we close in on his eyes. We cut to Tom Hanks' eyes on the U-boat as it's moving in to attack Normandy. So we think we're seeing, through the whole film, we think we're seeing the memories of the old man in the cemetery. But at the end of the film, Matt Damon morphs into the old man. So we've been seeing his memories the whole time. But the problem with that, Matt Damon wasn't on the beach. His character was never near the beaches of Normandy. So, Spielberg argued, well, chances are they told him about the beach. Fair enough. But show that scene, because the language of the cinema is absolute. They showed us that these eyes were the eyes of Tom Hanks, and they show us that they're not. They're the eyes of Matt Damon. Citizen Kane's got flaws. On the Waterfront's got flaws. You overlook it. And Spielberg explained it, so okay, fair enough.
Yeah, I was just about to say it's Rosebud all over again.
Yeah, it is. It's always nagged at me a little bit. It's a work of art. It won 5 Academy Awards, Best Director, Best Cinematography, Best Sound, Best Editing, and Best Sound Editing. How does the best directed, best shot, best sounding, best looking film lose Best Picture? Jesus, I still can't believe Shakespeare in Love won Best Picture over this movie. I can't believe it.
Yeah, agreed. But you're right. Even masterpieces have some flaws, and all my favorite movies do. And I think it's fun to point them out. It certainly doesn't ruin the movie for me.
No, if it ruins the movie, then they're not a masterpiece. But it doesn't ruin it at all. It's explained.
Yeah, and velociraptors were covered in feathers, and the T-Rex probably had very good vision, but whatever.
Yeah, okay.
There is one of Spielberg's films which I can't say enough good things about, and it was in development for a long time as a project for Stanley Kubrick. Um, it was eventually taken over by Steven Spielberg, and it was released in 2001, AI, Artificial Intelligence.
Yeah, Kubrick worked on this for, God, 15 years. And he and Spielberg began discussing it in 1997. And Kubrick was going to produce it. Spielberg was going to direct it. And when Stanley Kubrick died in 1999, Spielberg went to Kubrick's widow and said, I'd like to take this over and do it as a tribute to Stanley. And she said, go for it. She gave him all of his notes, all of his sketches, all of his shot-by-shot breakdowns, gave him everything. And he went off to make the movie. And what happens is you have a film that is part Stanley Kubrick, part Steven Spielberg. Mostly Steven Spielberg. It's based on a book called Super Toys Last All Summer Long, and is about a woman who's mourning the loss of her son, who's in a coma. So her husband brings home a super toy, who is David, played by Haley Joel Osment. And he's just like a real child. But if she says a special password to him, it encrypts on him, and he will unconditionally love her. And that love can never be broken. Eventually, in a horrifying sequence, she abandons him in the woods because her son gets well and comes home. And her son's a little prick and keeps injuring David and teasing David, and David, trying to get the boy to love him, nearly drowns him. So they abandon David in the woods, and he's sent on a mission to get back to his mother and find the blue fairy who will make him a real boy. A lot of Pinocchio overtones in the film. I love it. I loved it the first time I saw it. I've loved it ever since. I think it's a masterpiece. I think future generations will discover AI, artificial intelligence, and hail it for the masterpiece that it is. I think it's one of his best films, and just an absolute work of art.
Yeah, I completely agree. And you can see behind the camera Spielberg doing a bit of a Stanley Kubrick impression from time to time. And just a masterful performance from Haley Joel Osment.
A lot of people think that it should have ended. The Kubrick ending would have had it ending at the bottom of the sea with the boy staring at the blue fairy, the statue of the blue fairy. And fair enough, that's very likely how Kubrick would have ended it. But in the book, it does flash forward. He does go forward to see the mechas. A lot of people think they're aliens. They're not. They're machines that find the boy. I mean, it's a movie you really have to watch and listen to because there's a lot of an intellect in there.
Sticking with the science fiction genre, in 2002, Steven Spielberg released Minority Report with Tom Cruise.
This is a kick-ass movie. Roger Ebert called this the best film of 2002. I think it was one of them. Just a relentless breakneck speed action movie with Tom Cruise. Cruise does one of his greatest performances in this movie. It's about a future where murder can be predicted by precogs, psychics who help policemen determine when there's going to be a killing. And it's very dark. It's a dark film to look at, and the film has been bleached out to give it an even darker look to it. Cruise is terrific in the movie. He's a cop who helped set the whole thing up, and now he's been set up by his bosses as somebody who's going to commit the next murder. His son was abducted, has never been found, so he's angry. His marriage ended. It's just a whole complicated bit of business going for him. The portrayal of the future is spectacular. Cars going up and down the sides of buildings, and the dress is unique. The dress is different. Computers are something you can move around with your hands, very much like tablets now, which we do with our fingers. A great film, an absolutely great film. The reviews for it were spectacular, but it really didn't crack the box office. It did well, 200 million, but with a film like this, Tom Cruise, Steven Spielberg, you expect 400 to 500 million. And it just didn't get there. I think, like AI, it'll be rediscovered in years to come.
Mm-hmm. Thoroughly entertaining watch and a hell of a ride. Speaking more on that sort of Running Man type of movie, the same year we got Catch Me If You Can.
Yeah, what a great movie. This was, I think, the first time Leonardo DiCaprio really became an adult. I mean, he was so good in Gilbert Grape years before. But other than Titanic, he hadn't done a whole lot to be an adult actor. It was like John Travolta. Travolta was a kid in Saturday Night Fever and Grease and Urban Cowboy, but then with Blowout, he became an adult. In Catch Me If You Can, DiCaprio becomes an adult. It's based on the true story of Frank Abagnale, who was one of the most prolific forgers in United States history. $2.5 million this guy forged in bad checks while pretending to be a doctor, a lawyer, an airline pilot. The things this kid pulled off were unbelievable. And Spielberg gives the movie a real jaunty, bouncy feel right from the opening credits, which are animated. And with
Great music again from John Williams.
yeah, and sounding like the music of Henry Mancini from the 1960s, bouncy and upbeat. And DiCaprio is perfection, is Frank Abagnale, a perfect performance. Beautifully supported by Tom Hanks as the FBI guy who becomes his surrogate father. He has to have someone to talk to one Christmas. So who does he call? The FBI. And Tom Hanks' character says it, you've got no one else to call. And he's absolutely right. The kid is lonely. There's also an Oscar-nominated performance in there from Christopher Walken, who's wonderful. Amy Adams is terrific. A great cast, a great film.
Two mice fell into a bucket of cream. I love that story that he tells.
It's terrific. It's terrific. And it grabs you and never lets you go. It's colorful. It's got everything a good movie should have.
Yeah, real fun caper. Spielberg once again worked with Tom Hanks in what I think is an underrated movie, and I love it, from 2004, The Terminal.
Well, it's certainly an underrated performance. I think what Tom Hanks did in this movie was every bit as great as some of the things Chaplin did in City Lights, Modern Times, and The Great Dictator. We're not used to seeing Tom Hanks with an accent, and here he plays a Russian-esque character who ends up stranded in the airport when, as he's flying over to New York, there's a coup in his country, so he lands, and he's got no home. He has no country. Therefore, he can't leave the airport. And Hanks is wonderful in the movie. He owns the movie from beginning to end. Spielberg actually built an airport in an old shopping mall, built a replica of Kennedy Airport, JFK, in the film. And it's terrific to look at. Not a lot happens in the movie other than what's going on around Hanks. And Hanks' performance is so dominant. The other actors, Stanley Tucci's in the movie and Catherine Zeta-Jones, but the movie belongs to Hanks. He's terrific. I think it's a good movie. I don't think it's a great movie, but I think Tom Hanks' performance is a great performance.
Yeah, playing Victor Navorsky from the fictional nation of Krakozia. Tom Hanks spoke mock Bulgarian, using his father-in-law as an influence for the accent and the foreign language, etc. I agree. I think it's just a great performance, which makes it totally worthy to take another look at. 2005 was another big year for Steven Spielberg. We're here now. Let's talk about it. War of the Worlds.
There's so much greatness in War of the Worlds, and the whole 9/11 shadow and ghost falls all over the early parts of the film. At one point, you hear Dakota Fanning scream when the explosions are going off, "Oh my God, is it the terrorists?"
Yeah.
And this is what it must have been like in 9/11. Cher and I were in New York in 2010, and we didn't encounter a single cab driver who didn't have a 9/11 story. That disaster impacted everybody in that city, and War of the Worlds gives you that impression. It's loosely based on the H.G. Wells novel, also loosely based on the 1953 film about an alien invasion. And Tom Cruise plays a kind of a deadbeat single divorced dad, who's trying to deal with his children who really don't like him. And when the creatures come up, there's just a paralyzing scene where he's running through the street, and the ashes of the people who are dying as they run in front of him are attaching themselves to his face. And by the time he gets back to his house, his hair is gray with the ashes of the dead, and he's managed to stay alive. And they hit the road, and they go like hell across New Jersey trying to get to Boston to find the mother. The aliens are everywhere. These towering machines are everywhere, and they are exterminating mankind. That's what they're there to do. There's a scene where his son for whatever reason, has the need to fight, has the need to join the army
I
and go.
hated that kid.
Yeah, he's an annoying guy. And off he goes over the hill to fight. At the end of the film, when the creatures die because they've been exposed to bacteria, which is in the book, who shows up at the parents' house? Who's there at the in-laws' house but the son?
Ugh.
And the final 20 seconds of this movie made my stomach churn. It was such a great film until then, and I thought, wow, they're really going to do it. The kid's dead. And then you see his shadow.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh no, oh no. And down he goes and he hugs his father, who he hated because he's learned so much about humanity. And his father got his sister to him. So now they're friends. I thought, Jesus.
When
But
he went over that hill, I was so happy. I'm like, good. I hate this kid. He's dead. We don't have to deal with him anymore.
oh, he's a pain. He's a pain. But it's got a lot of greatness in it. There's a lot of great things in War of the Worlds. It's just very nearly undone by that ending. And
No.
it's hard to shake that ending, man. It's hard not to see it once you've seen it.
Yeah, a lot of films that I dislike on the whole have greatness in them. I have a question here, and maybe you can explain this to me. So, the aliens came. By the way, for anyone listening, this was the first Spielberg movie about aliens where the outcome of our first encounter is probably like what would actually happen. I'm not expecting Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Sorry to be a buzzkill. So the aliens came and they shot down in lightning into machines that they had planted in the ground on Earth millions of years ago. Am I right so far?
Yep.
Okay. What was their motivation? Was it just to be violent and exterminate? Because if they had been here millions of years ago, why didn't they just take over the planet? I never understood that.
I don't either. I think their point here was to exterminate us and mine the planet for its resources and then move on to another planet.
Yeah.
That's it. That's it. But you're right. Millions of years ago, why not just do it then? And then they wouldn't have had to kill people. They would have had to deal with dinosaurs. Maybe that's why. Maybe they didn't want to fight the dinosaurs. Who knows?
Jurassic Park versus War of the Worlds.
Yeah, yeah.
And then, 1993, Spielberg directed two movies in 2005. One was a popcorn movie, one was not. The other film was Munich. Talk about that.
This is one of his best films, and it's one of his coldest movies. I mean, it takes an unflinching look at the Olympic massacre in 1972, when a group of Israeli athletes were massacred, and Israel decided to retaliate. And they sent a kill squad out to eliminate the men who had set up the extermination of these athletes. They knew who they were. And this crew of men, led by Eric Bana, move around the world, eliminating the guys that set up the Olympic massacre. I remember that massacre. I remember the guy going on the news and breaking down and saying, they're all gone. They're all gone. And it was just, oh my God, even at my first exposure to terrorism, really. Spielberg told the story with precision and a documentary eye. He took no side. He just shot it as it was and shot the truth. And it was brilliant. Munich was one of the greatest films I've ever seen. And when it began making its rounds with the critics in 2005, they all said the same. Year's Best Picture, year's Best Director. Again, brilliant. And then Brokeback Mountain came out. And that ended that.
Right. It was a good year.
2005 was a great year. It's a shame they gave Best Picture to a piece of junk like Crash.
Never heard of it.
I will never forget the look on Jack Nicholson's face when he opened the envelope. Everybody thought Brokeback Mountain. Everybody. And it was Crash. And the look on Nicholson's face is just, oh my God. And yeah, oh my God.
Yeah, I remember that moment too.
Yeah.
All right, time for some fun. Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and go.
This was one of the first times, I hope it's the only time, I ever get caught up in nostalgia. The first time I saw the film, I come out grinning. And then I took Sherry to see it on the weekend. And we come out and we tore the movie apart all the way home. And I realized my review was in, my review was filed. I had said I liked it. And I had to do a complete overhaul in my review. I did it a week later. I wrote that I had previously stated how much I liked Indiana Jones. And The Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, well, I've had time to think about it. Where do you start? Shia LaBeouf swinging through the trees like a monkey, like Tarzan, surviving an atomic blast rather in a refrigerator. It's just, it's such a stupid movie, and yet again, it had those moments.
So
The
much
first,
fun.
the first time we see the hat, and he picks up the hat and we put it on, it's like seeing an old friend again. And out comes the bullwhip. And, but then you got Kate Blanchett playing a Russian with a Louise Brooks haircut, and she's such a one-note villain. And then you see Karen Allen. You're happy again because, wow, Karen Allen's back. She's great. They've got such lovely chemistry. But then we realize Shia LaBeouf's his son. And oh my God, slit your wrists now, because who wants a punk like this for a son? And then the ending with these interdimensional beings.
Aliens.
And John Hurt seems to be out of his mind talking gibberish, but really isn't out of his mind. He's really just somehow been taken over by these minds. And my God, it's like seeing it and then thinking the horror.
Yeah, I remember thinking, aliens again, Spielberg. It's like, haven't you covered this already?
And there were so many other great ideas. Frank Darabont had written a script that was apparently wonderful, but nobody wanted to do it. Lucas wanted to do this, and Spielberg always said, "Whatever you want to do with Indiana Jones, it's your call."
My favorite moment of the film is when they're in the warehouse and they're in the trucks driving after him, and he's swinging from a beam on the bullwhip, and as he's about to collide with him, Ray Winstone's just screaming, "You don't know him! You don't know him! You don't know him!"
Yeah, and they drive by and they see a crate busted open, and there's the Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah,
Raiders of the Lost Ark. It has little moments all the way through it, and those are the moments that hit me the first time.
Yeah.
But then you get watching it and talking about it and thinking, oh boy, it stinks. They fooled me. They got me. And they got me.
Yeah. I remember reading your first review. I don't know if I read the second one, but I believe it came up in class. We discussed it.
Yeah, it wasn't a negative review, but it was a positive review. I remember it wasn't a rave. I do remember that, because the whole monkey scene and the killer ants really bugged me.
Yeah.
But then I wrote a complete overhaul a couple weeks later and spoke my mind, got it right.
In 2011, Spielberg collaborated with Peter Jackson on a CGI animated motion capture adaptation of the famous comic strip, The Adventures of Tintin. This was supposed to be the first of 3 collaborations. The film was directed by Spielberg and produced by Peter Jackson. The second one was supposed to flip that, and then they were supposed to co-direct and co-produce the third one. Don't know if those next 2 films will ever happen, but I kind of love this movie. What do you think?
I liked it too. I knew nothing about Tintin, nothing. Had never heard of it, and walked into it. Well, I was sent a screener at the year's end because it was award season, and watched it and totally enjoyed it. I liked the references to Raiders of the Lost Ark, the sequences in the desert especially. Love the voice acting. Jamie Bell I thought was terrific. It had a lot of good things in it. And then it won the Golden Globe for Best Animated Feature. And everyone thinks it's going to get Oscar nominated. Then it doesn't.
Right.
And it was shocking that it wasn't Oscar nominated. And I don't know if they're going to do any more. It did okay at the box office. It didn't do hugely well, but mostly over here because people don't know who the hell Tintin is. It was a huge hit in Europe, Ireland, Paris, but not over here.
Yeah, I remember when he accepted that Golden Globe, something that sticks in my memory is that he made a point of thanking someone who I think is like the greatest actor in the world. He said, "The man of 1,000 digital faces, Andy Serkis."
Yes. Yeah, I know you love Andy.
Once again, popcorn movie and then a serious movie in the same year. 2011 also saw War Horse.
Yeah, I quite like War Horse. I know it's taken some heat from some critics, but he saw the play, a very famous play, and he wanted instantly to make the movie. He bought the rights, and then again, very quickly, within a year, the movie was in theaters. And it's a very old-fashioned movie. Back when they, the 30s and the 40s, when they used to make animal movies, My Friend Flicka, Thunderhead, Smokey, Lassie. Here's a movie about a horse who is drafted into service by the army in the First World War, and a boy joins the army to find his horse, and he finds him. And it's a very emotional, beautiful story about a kid and his pet, and shot like it was made by Victor Fleming, a famous director in the 30s and the 40s. He directed Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz, and he made movies that had very picturesque settings. And this one lovingly looks at the countryside in England and beautifully shoots the horse and captures the horrors of the war, the First World War, the no Man's Land, captures that spectacularly. There's a wonderful scene in the film where the boy and a young German soldier go and cut the horse out of barbed wire, which is beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And then they go back to trying to kill each other. And for whatever reason, critics kind of attacked it for being sentimental, for being old-fashioned. Spielberg didn't hide behind that. He admitted, yeah, it's old-fashioned. I was trying to capture the look of the movies Victor Fleming and John Ford made. And it was nominated for Best Picture, but he was not nominated that year for Best Director, which doesn't make any sense to me. But this is also after they increased the number of Best Picture nominees to up to 10 after the debacle of The Dark Knight.
Next film we're going to talk about is one I remember being in anticipation for several years. And Steven Spielberg, Abraham Lincoln, Daniel Day-Lewis.
Were you disappointed? Were you disappointed by any aspect of it?
I'll give you a little anecdote. So Lincoln is like pushing 3 hours long, and it's a movie with men in drab settings and drab clothing, speaking humongous amounts of dialogue about politics and all kinds of stuff like that. Not exactly the type of movie you want to have a couple of drinks for before you go see.
Right.
I happened to, back in the day, I remember I had a lunch prior to seeing this movie where I did have a couple in me, and I was a little buzzed. And nevertheless, I was riveted from start to finish.
Yeah, me too. Me too. I think it's one of the best written movies of the last 25 years. Tony Kushner wrote the script based on the book by Doris Kearns. And they chose to focus on the bill, the Emancipation Bill to free the slaves, rather than tell the whole story of Lincoln's life. And for years, Liam Neeson was going to play Lincoln. And then finally, Spielberg said, you know what, if we don't get going on this, you're going to be too old to do it. So Neeson withdrew. And he went to Daniel Day-Lewis, who said, I'll do it, but I need a year to prepare. And Spielberg said, a year? We're ready to go in 6 months. He said, I got to find the voice. And he read, he says, and I believe him, 76 books on Lincoln. And he finally found the voice when a witness discussed the high, reedy voice of Abraham Lincoln, which carries further. And so he had it. Sally Field had been cast as Mary Todd with Neeson, but when it came time to make the movie Daniel Day-Lewis, Spielberg wasn't sure that she could do it. There was an age difference. She went to him and convinced them both that, yeah, she could do it. I think Daniel Day-Lewis was astonishing in the movie. In the opening scene, you see him talking to the two young black soldiers. And I'm sitting there watching it thinking, I'm watching Abraham Lincoln alive. Never once was I bored watching that film. It's history. You got to listen. I mean, you can't sit there and talk to people or be looking around. You have to pay attention. I think it's brilliant. I think Spielberg should have won Best Director in a tie that year with Catherine Bigelow for Zero Dark 30. And Lincoln should have won Best Picture in a tie with Zero Dark 30. I think it's a masterpiece.
I think Lincoln should have won Best Supporting Actor for Tommy Lee Jones.
I agree with that too. He was superb. Absolutely superb.
And you're right. I remember when it was going to be Liam Neeson, and I thought that was great casting. And I'm sure he would have done a good job. But then when I heard Daniel Day-Lewis, it's like, okay, well, it's Daniel Day-Lewis. You know what kind of performance you're going to get out of him.
Yeah, how do you argue? How do you argue that? And, you know, Liam Neeson is being rumored to play George Washington. Martin Scorsese's got a George Washington movie on the books. I think it's the second one down the list. And if he makes that in the next 3 years, Liam Neeson can play George Washington, and I'm sure he'll do just great.
Yeah, take all my money already. I'm so down for that.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Day-Lewis Day-Lewis did win his third Academy Award for Best Actor for Lincoln. He was the first actor to ever win an Oscar in a Steven Spielberg movie,
Yeah.
and the first man to win 3 Best Actor Academy Awards.
There's something telling about his performance because there are no recordings of Abraham Lincoln that exist.
None.
But when you watch it, you just intrinsically know 100% this is absolutely what he sounded and acted like.
Yes, completely. Completely. As I said, it was like watching Lincoln. Lincoln was alive.
I remember seeing a photo of Daniel Day-Lewis out getting coffee after filming had started, and just seeing him with the goatee, I was already blown away.
Yeah. Yeah. Brilliant, brilliant movie.
Absolutely. Bridge of Spies in 2015 would mark the first time in a while that John Williams didn't provide the score for Spielberg's movie. I think it was for health reasons, but it's another Tom Hanks Spielberg collaboration, and I think it's a great film.
I do too, and you're absolutely right. It was for health reasons that Williams couldn't do the score. This is based on a true story about a spy who was captured in the 1950s and the American lawyer who was appointed to defend him and essentially keep him alive. And Mark Rylance, a Broadway actor, plays the spy, and he won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. He's a wonderful actor.
Yeah.
And his opening scenes where he's captured are terrific. And you just can't take your eyes off this guy. But I really had hoped Sylvester Stallone would win the Oscar that year for Creed, and was really surprised when Mark Rylance won for Bridge of Spies. Tom Hanks was wonderful. I thought he should have been nominated. It was up for Best Picture. Spielberg, again, snubbed for Best Director. But you're right, a solid film, solid, entertaining historical film.
I totally agree about Stallone. 2016, this is a movie that you absolutely love, and it kind of failed. And it was the first real collaboration between Disney and Spielberg, and it's called the BFG.
Yeah, and I do love it. I don't know why. I just thought it was such a great story. And I thought Mark Rylance did a wonderful job as the giant. And I thought the little girl was terrific. I thought it was a perfect presentation of a fairy tale for children put on screen. It had been a long time since we'd seen that. It was magical. It had darkness in it, dark elements in it, and yet Spielbergian in every way. The visual effects were spectacular. Mark Rylance was mocapped into being the giant, and has such soulful eyes. And his dialogue, the words that he said were unique and different, taken right from the book, and fascinating. Just a fascinating movie from beginning to end. A lot of people didn't like it, didn't make a lot of money, but I like it.
I also really enjoyed it.
Yep, I thought it was a terrific fairy tale put on screen.
All right, we've got one more political drama and one more popcorn movie before we start talking about the future. 2017, Streep, Hanks, Spielberg, The Post.
This film came together so fast. He read the script for this in January. They started shooting in April. They were finished shooting the end of June. They cut it, and it was in theaters in December. And I loved it. I saw it opening day, before opening day, saw it on a screener, and thought it was brilliant. Ben Bradley, the character Tom Hanks plays, had already been portrayed on film by Jason Robards in All the President's Men, and he won an Oscar for it. I thought Hanks was perfect, equally good in every way as Ben Bradley, but the performance in the film of Meryl Streep as Katharine Graham is spectacular. She had the weight of the world placed on her shoulders when they came into possession of the Pentagon Papers, and she made the decision to publish because Nixon had said, do not publish. And she did it anyway. She defied him, and it tore down the United States government for their involvement in Vietnam. They knew they were losing Vietnam and should have been out years before they actually were. It's beautifully written by a first-time screenwriter and nicely directed by Spielberg, but the performances are what carry the movie. Streep was nominated for Best Actress, and again, a Best Picture nomination without a Spielberg nomination. 2 nominations, which is kind of strange. But yes, a great film, a truly great film.
There have been criticisms towards big budget blockbuster superhero films. I think it might have even been Scorsese who compared the Marvel films to theme park rides or attractions, which I don't necessarily think is a bad thing. But if you want to talk about big budget popcorn theme park rides, Ready Player One is certainly that. And it's an Easter egg with Easter eggs and Easter eggs. And it just, I mean, go. What are your thoughts?
Well, you know me. I'm not a big superhero movie fan. I'm not a big comic book movie fan, and I'm not a gamer. And this movie kind of combines all three. I was thoroughly entertained. I love the 80 references and seeing all these characters from Days Gone By show up, King Kong, the Iron Giant. I thought that was wonderful. But I mean, I've watched it twice. I'm not sure I'll ever watch it again. It was a really frenetic, fast-paced, hyperactive movie. And everything just felt to me speeded up. And maybe that's just me because I'm not a gamer. I don't know, but it felt like it was going in fast motion, and it didn't need to. So that's my take on it.
It is a ride, and I think it's a fun ride. And
You're right. It is a ride. It is a theme park ride. And as I said, I was thoroughly entertained. But is it about anything at the end of the day? Is it really about anything?
well, I remember this year, 2018, and you were very enthusiastic about Ready Player One off the bat, and I remember enjoying it and also thinking about Avengers Infinity War, another big popcorn movie. And the main difference for me was Ready Player One, sure, all those good things, but I don't really care about these characters, whereas in Avengers Infinity War, I cared everything about the characters.
That's a great point. That's a great point. Not once did I care about the characters. Not once.
Yeah.
Did I
But
think about
there's so
them?
much
No.
fun to be had in pointing out the little things. I remember in the beginning when he's narrating, he's like, you could climb Mount Everest with Batman. And, you know, in the big car chase, you see the 66 Batmobile, and the
Yeah.
T-Rex from Jurassic Park even shows up.
Well, I think they must have had a great time picking and choosing what was going to be in the movie, you know, and then bringing it to the movie. It must have just been a big wet dream making the movie. But I don't know, didn't work overall for me. It was a lot of fun, but I rarely thought about it since.
Yeah, it's a ride and a fun one at that, but it's good looking. It's, you know, I think it's fine. So now it's 2020 and Steven Spielberg is making West Side Story.
Yeah, West Side Story is finished. It's being cut as we speak, and it's coming to theaters in December. And a quick West Side Story story. In 2010, I took my family to New York City, and on the cover of Time magazine had been a story about the new version of West Side Story that had premiered on Broadway. And we went to see it, and at intermission, I was ready to leave. I was done. The only reason we stayed is because my youngest daughter wanted to hear them sing one of the songs. I forget what it was. So we stayed, and the second act was worse than the first act. It was just dreadful. I don't know what all the acclaim was about. Spielberg has kept the film in the 1950s and 60s and kept all the songs intact from the original. I just don't know why. I don't know why. The first film is still vital. It's still exciting. It's still interesting. Why do we need a new version? To me, the original film won 10 Academy Awards. To me, it's like remaking something, an iconic musical like, The Sound of Music. Why anybody ever would remake that piece of junk, I don't know. But it's like remaking
Dark and gritty remake.
Yeah, well, yeah, something. I don't understand why he chose to do it. What I would have loved to see, can you imagine if Steven Spielberg had decided to direct Wicked?
Yeah.
Man, I'm there opening friggin' day, I'd be there. But West Side Story, I'm worried. I'm seriously worried as to whether or not this will work.
Yeah, Spielberg's Wicked, as opposed to Oz the Great and Powerful, that dreadful film we ended up getting.
Yeah.
Aside from the Tintin sequels, which may be in limbo right now, anything you want to talk about regarding what's coming up, what you'd like to see Spielberg do?
Well, he's got the Indiana Jones movie he's talking about, and I hope they don't do it. Or if they do it, they cast Chris Pratt as the young Indiana Jones and tell stories in flashback. Let Harrison Ford play old Indy and let him tell stories in flashback with Chris Pratt as the young Indiana Jones. That I would go to see. That I would be happy to see.
That would be
Spielberg has,
great.
it would. I mean, and if we're thinking it, they've got to be thinking it. We hope, you know.
Yeah, it's never
Spielberg
going
is
to happen.
also he's also talked about making a film about the Revolutionary War that I would be fascinated to see his take on that if he ever decides to get going on that. And if Martin Scorsese doesn't do the George Washington movie, Spielberg has said that if his buddy Marty gives it up, he'll do it. That would be cool to see him do George Washington.
Well, that would be cool because there's another presidential biopic Scorsese's looking at, which I'm even more excited for, which is Teddy Roosevelt with DiCaprio.
And rumor has it that's coming right after the one they're doing now, the Western they're doing now.
That would be great because
Yeah.
Martin Scorsese, greatest living director, Leonardo DiCaprio, enough said, and Teddy Roosevelt, most badass human being that ever lived.
He kicked ass. He was a scary dude, you know, and went
Yeah.
all the way to the presidency. And his own people were afraid of him. Unpredictable.
Anything Spielberg hasn't done that maybe something different that maybe you'd like to see him try?
I'd love to see him do a Western, like a real down-to-earth, gritty American Western. I'd love to see that because I think he could do a great job. I've always secretly hoped he and Harrison Ford would remake The Searchers. Harrison Ford's too old now, but they could remake The Searchers with Christian Bale. He could play Ethan Edwards beautifully. I'd love to see that. I'd love to see him bring something like the HBO series that he worked on, The Pacific. He produced that with Tom Hanks. I'd love to see a film like that brought to the big screen because the Pacific Theater on film hasn't really been explored all that much. That'd be cool. But no, I'm satisfied with his filmography. He's done everything I think he ever set out to do and more, and has given audiences things that'll be discussed long after we're gone.
It's interesting that you mentioned Harrison Ford being too old for The Searchers, but yet he's not too old for Indiana Jones and the Legend of the Rusted Wheelchair or whatever it is that we're going to get.
Well, who knows? Who knows what they're going to call it or even what it's going to be. I truly hope they involve Chris Pratt. His name was bandied around at one point when they weren't going to cast Harrison Ford, but Harrison Ford, stepped in and said, "Hey, I want to be part of this." But do it. Do him as an aged Indy with flashbacks of Pratt. That would be great. That would be terrific.
Chris Pratt's character in Guardians of the Galaxy has an introduction which is quite similar to Indy's in Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yeah. And he's got that cock of the town sort of feel about him, that Indiana Jones had too.
Have you ever interviewed Spielberg?
I have not. I've spoken to him on the phone, but I have never interviewed him in depth.
Any final thoughts?
Well, every now and then you run into a student. When I was a teacher at the Toronto Film School, every once in a while you'd run into a student who would trash Steven Spielberg. And I would always immediately pounce on them and just say, "Tell me why. All he makes is mainstream movies." And your problem? Well, his movies are all successful. That's not his fault. That's absolutely not his fault. People go to his movies. What's wrong with making movies that people love, that people want to see? The whole point of making a film, is for people to see it, is it not? So why attack him for that? If that's all they got to attack him for, then have at it.
Yeah. I remember being your student and having a discussion. It wasn't about Spielberg. It was about War of the Worlds, which we kind of tackled here. But yeah, that's it's something that annoys me is when musicians are referred to as sellouts. And it's like, why? Because they're successful? Well, they changed their style. It's like, okay, they evolved and they didn't want to keep doing the same thing. It's not a real criticism.
Steven Spielberg has achieved exactly what he wanted to achieve. He never wanted to be independent from the studios. He never wanted to put his own money into the studios. He wanted to be a Hollywood director, friendly with the studios, a mogul. And he's become that. The man's worth $1 billion. And he's achieved that working for the studios. And George Lucas, who wanted to be independent, is independent, but is not terribly well liked. And Spielberg is. Very few people have anything negative to say about Spielberg. Early in his career, yeah, there was lots negative to say. He acted like a fool with the editor of Jaws. He never worked with her again after she won the Oscar. The same thing happened with the cinematographer of Close Encounters. But you know what? He grew up. He stuck with John Williams all through his career. He stuck with Janusz Kaminski the last several films he's made. The man grew up. So he's evolved, and he's evolved from a really solid director to a brilliant filmmaker.
There you have it, folks, our Steven Spielberg showcase. Thanks to all our listeners. That's episode number 8 for anyone who's counting. Be sure to tell all your friends to check us out. We're on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all the social medias. Got some cool ideas for upcoming episodes. It's just about March, and so John and I are getting ready to discuss actors and films from the Emerald Isle for St. Patrick's Day. That and a lot more cool stuff in upcoming episodes. Check out our YouTube channel for this. Like and subscribe. Till next time, see you at the movies.
And cut. Brennan?